A bankrupt farmer was about to lose everything until his old horse led him to a secret buried beneath the desert, one that would change an entire town. In the dying heat of a Nevada summer, Henry Cole sat in silence, clutching the foreclosure notice that would erase his family's name from the land. Outside, his horse, Rust, stood motionless under the burning sky, until, without warning, it began to paw the ground, staring toward the Red Canyon. That single, stubborn act would pull Henry into a journey of faith, greed, and redemption the world would never forget. The evening sun stretched long shadows across the dry Nevada plains, painting the wooden fences of Henry Cole's ranch in tired shades of gold. Inside the small farmhouse, a man sat at a kitchen table cluttered with bills, his rough hands trembling as he unfolded the newest envelope. The seal of the bank glared back at him like an execution notice. Foreclosure notice. The words felt heavier than any shovel he'd ever lifted. Henry leaned back, the old chair creaking beneath his weight. Through the dusty window, he could see his horse, Rust, standing still under the fading light. The animal's coat shimmered a deep chestnut brown, glinting like old copper in the sun. Rust raised his head, ears twitching, as if he could sense the storm gathering inside the man. "Guess that's it, old boy," Henry murmured, voice dry as the desert wind. "They're taking it all." Outside, the land stretched endlessly, flat, brittle, and sunburned. It had been in his family for generations, but years of drought and debt had stripped it bare. His wife, Martha, had always said the soil would give back one day. But Martha was gone now, buried on the small hill overlooking the corral, and the earth hadn't given back a thing. Ben, his 17-year-old son, came through the door with dust on his boots and defiance in his eyes. "Another letter?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Henry didn't look up. "Yeah." Ben tossed his hat onto the counter. "You could have sold the land months ago, Dad. We'd be somewhere better by now. Maybe in Carson City, maybe even Reno. You're holding on to a dead dream." Henry's jaw clenched. "Your mother made me promise." "Mom's gone," Ben shot back, his voice cracking somewhere between anger and pain. "And this place is killing you." The silence that followed was long and heavy, broken only by the faint thump of Rust's hooves outside. Henry stared at the letter again, then folded it neatly and slid it into the drawer beneath the table, where dozens of others already lay. "I'm not leaving," he said finally. "Not yet," Ben scoffed, grabbing his jacket. "You'll wait till they chain the gate shut. You'll see." He slammed the door behind him. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot, leaving Henry alone with the hum of cicadas and the faint creak of the windmill outside. Rust let out a low, restless snort, pacing near the fence as if something out there had caught his attention. Henry rose, pushing open the screen door. "What is it, boy?" Rust lifted his head toward the far horizon, where the desert rolled into a range of crimson canyons. The last light of day glowed on the horse's face, and for a brief, fleeting moment, Henry thought he saw something in those dark eyes, a spark of urgency, almost human. But then the moment passed. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of dust and dry sage. Henry placed a calloused hand on Rust's neck. "You and me, we've seen better days," he whispered. The horse nickered softly, leaning into the touch. In the distance, thunder rolled across the desert, not from a storm, but from a coming reckoning Henry couldn't yet name. As the night settled, he sat on the porch with a half-empty cup of coffee, watching the moon rise over the ridge. Each beam of light cut through the darkness, silver and cold, like the glint of buried metal. Rust stood in the same spot all night, facing that far canyon, unmoving. Henry noticed it only once before drifting to sleep in his chair, the horse's hooves tapping gently at the earth, as if marking a place forgotten by men, but remembered by something older than time. The desert night was colder than Henry remembered. When he finally stirred from the porch chair, dawn was still hours away. The stars were sharp, glittering against the ink-black sky, and Rust stood just where he had before, by the fence, still staring toward the canyons. Henry rubbed his eyes, joints aching. "You haven't moved, huh?" The horse flicked his tail, but didn't turn. He walked down the path, the dry earth crunching under his boots. The silence wrapped around him like an old coat, familiar, heavy. He reached the fence, resting his arm across the top rail. The moonlight painted the land in silver and ash. Beyond, the vast desert stretched toward the ridge where the canyons began, ancient and indifferent. For a long time, Henry just watched Rust, feeling that strange pull again, the sense that the horse knew something he didn't. But it wasn't the kind of knowledge a man could ask for. He sighed and turned toward the hill behind the house. There, a small wooden cross leaned slightly in the wind. Martha's grave. He hadn't been up there in weeks. Tonight felt like the right time. Climbing the hill, he passed the lone mesquite tree, its thin branches whispering in the wind. When he reached the grave, he knelt, brushing the dust from the name carved into the wood. Martha Cole, beloved wife and mother. He stayed there a while, hands folded, breathing the cold air that smelled faintly of sage and dust. "They're taking the ranch, Martha," he said softly. "Ben's right. Maybe I'm just too damn stubborn." The silence that followed was deep, but not empty. Somewhere in it, he thought he could still hear her voice. "Keep the land for our son." It wasn't a command. It was a whisper of faith, the kind that survives when everything else has turned to dust. Henry took off his hat and held it to his chest. "I don't know how, but I'll keep my word." When he rose, Rust had followed him halfway up the hill. The horse's breath misted in the chill air. Henry chuckled softly. "You really think I can fix this mess, boy?" Rust nudged his shoulder gently. That simple gesture made something break open inside him, a small, stubborn flame of hope. He went back inside the farmhouse, poured the last of the coffee into a tin mug, and sat at the table again. The foreclosure letter lay there like a wound. He picked it up, read the words once more, then folded it carefully and tucked it inside Martha's old Bible. It wasn't defiance this time. It was devotion. The next morning came slow and pale. Ben was already outside, saddling his old dirt bike for work at the feed store. He avoided eye contact. "You going somewhere today?" he asked flatly. "Just chores," Henry said. Ben nodded, but didn't look convinced. "If you're thinking about another loan, Dad, don't. They don't give second chances." Henry managed a tired smile. "Then maybe I'll have to make one." Ben frowned but didn't push. He revved the engine and rode off, a streak of dust trailing behind. Rust pawed at the ground again, restless. Henry followed his gaze toward the horizon. The morning light shimmered across the canyon ridges like polished metal. For a heartbeat, the reflection flashed bright. So bright it looked almost like silver. He blinked, and it was gone. Still, something in his chest shifted. A feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this land than bills and broken promises. Maybe this place had been holding its own secret all along. He saddled Rust and rode out, slow at first, then faster as the sun climbed higher. The wind whipped through his hair, and for the first time in months, he felt alive. They passed the dry creek bed, the withered cottonwoods, the silent fences. Every inch of it was familiar, but under the morning light it looked different, like the world had exhaled and started over. Rust suddenly stopped. Ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. Henry leaned in. "What is it?" The horse let out a low whinny, then began to walk toward the red ridge in the distance. Henry followed. "All right then," he muttered. "Lead the way." He didn't know it yet, but that simple choice, to trust his horse's instinct, was about to rewrite the story of his life, his family, and every man who'd ever stood on Nevada soil praying the earth would love him back. As they disappeared into the morning haze, the sun broke through the clouds, lighting the canyons in gold and flame. For the first time, Henry didn't feel afraid of tomorrow. He felt ready to protect his home, his financial future, and the promise he'd made beneath the desert sky. The Nevada sun rose like a forge, spilling gold across the vast emptiness. Heat shimmered above the sand, bending the horizon until sky and earth melted into one. Henry squinted beneath the brim of his hat, his shirt already damp with sweat. Rust moved steadily beneath him, hooves thudding on the baked ground with a rhythm that felt ancient, patient, like the heartbeat of the land itself. They had ridden for miles. The house was long gone, swallowed by the haze. Ahead, the desert unfurled, raw, endless, whispering its own language in the wind. Every gust carried stories of men who once dreamed of fortune here, miners and drifters chasing veins of silver that never loved them back. Rust suddenly slowed, ears pricking toward a far-off canyon. Henry followed his gaze. The cliffs glowed red in the morning light, streaked with gray like old scars. Something about the place tugged at him, a quiet pull that defied logic. He wiped the sweat from his brow. "You sure about this, boy?" he asked. Rust tossed his head and kept walking. The closer they came, the stronger Henry felt it. The air grew cooler, touched by the scent of mineral and dust. Tiny flecks of mica glittered in the soil, catching the sun like scattered stars. He dismounted, crouched, and ran his fingers through the dirt. It shimmered faintly, an echo of silver veins deep below. He thought of the foreclosure notice tucked inside Martha's Bible, of Ben's harsh words, of the promise made at her grave. The weight of all that loss pressed against his chest. But here, standing at the edge of something unknown, that weight shifted. Lighter somehow, almost hopeful. Rust pawed the ground, impatient. Henry smiled faintly. All right, he muttered. "You found something, didn't you?" The horse stepped forward into a narrow passage between two rocks, barely wide enough for a man. Henry followed, ducking low. The canyon opened suddenly into a hollow basin, the air still and glowing. Sunlight spilled through a crack in the cliff, igniting the dust into 1,000 silver motes that danced like spirits. For a long moment, Henry simply stood there, awed by the quiet beauty. Then Rust began to dig. His hooves struck the earth again and again, the sound echoing off the walls. Henry frowned. "Hey, easy now. What are you—" Something clinked beneath the dirt. Henry dropped to his knees and brushed the surface aside. There, half buried in clay, lay a small chunk of dull metal. He picked it up. The weight told him before his eyes did. It was silver. Old, unrefined, but real. His heart hammered. Good Lord! He looked at Rust, who stood motionless now, watching him with calm certainty. For the first time in years, Henry laughed. A full, astonished laugh that startled even himself. He held the silver toward the light, and the beam caught it just right, turning the dull gray into a blaze of white. For an instant, he imagined the ranch safe again. Ben smiling, the mortgage paid off, maybe even a little money left for a better retirement plan. But the desert was a trickster. It gave and it took in the same breath. As Henry turned the piece over in his hands, he noticed faint tool marks, edges chipped by pickaxes long gone. Someone had been here before. He stood, scanning the canyon walls. There were old timbers half buried in sand, the remnants of a mine entrance collapsed long ago. Rust pawed the dirt once more, uncovering another sliver of metal, then another. Henry's pulse quickened. Could it be? A forgotten mine, one of the lost veins from the Virginia City days? He remembered the old men in town talking about them, the ghost shafts of silver left behind when fortunes dried up. The thought struck him like lightning. This could save everything. He staggered back a step, looking up at the strip of sky above the canyon, burning bright and cruel. He thought of Martha's words, "Keep the land for our son." Maybe this was what she meant. Maybe the land itself had been keeping something for him all along. Henry sank to his knees again, overwhelmed. The silver in his hand gleamed like a second chance, like grace made solid. Rust nudged his shoulder gently, as if to remind him, the earth gives, but it also tests. "Thank you, boy," Henry whispered, voice shaking. "You found it." He stayed there until the light began to fade, unable to pull himself away. When he finally mounted Rust and turned toward home, the desert behind him glowed faintly, as if the ground itself still breathed silver. As they rode, Henry looked up at the sky painted in purple and flame. Somewhere between faith and desperation, he felt Martha's promise stir again, not as a burden, but as a guide. He didn't yet know how to handle what he'd found, how to claim it, protect it, or tell anyone. But one truth rang clear as the bell of the windmill miles away. His fight wasn't over, and for the first time in years, the land didn't feel silent anymore. It was speaking, calling. The next morning, Henry could still feel the weight of the silver in his pocket. Even after he washed the dirt from his hands, a faint gray shimmer clung to his skin, as if the desert had marked him. Ben was already outside, loading hay into the old truck when Henry stepped out. The boy looked up, wary. "You're back early," he said. "Where'd you go yesterday?" Henry hesitated. "Just riding. Needed to clear my head." Ben narrowed his eyes, sensing more but too tired to argue. "Well, the bank called again. Said we've got a week." A week? The word hung in the air like a noose. Henry looked toward the horizon. The red ridge glowed faintly under the morning sun, calling to him again. "Don't you worry, son," he said quietly. "Things might be looking up." That evening, after Ben had gone to bed, Henry took a lantern and a small shovel, saddled Rust, and rode back into the night. The desert spread before him, silent except for the wind, sighing through the sagebrush. When they reached the canyon, it looked different under the stars. The rocks shimmered faintly, silver threads glowing where the moonlight touched the stone. Henry dismounted, heart pounding. He knelt where Rust had dug before and began clearing away more earth. The sound of metal against stone echoed softly. One after another, small pieces of ore appeared. Rough, dark, but unmistakable. Silver, enough to fill both hands. He held the lantern close, its light dancing across the metal's dull sheen. The reflection looked like liquid moonlight. He felt dizzy, half from excitement, half from fear. This wasn't just luck. It was a miracle, the kind that could pull a man from the edge. "Rust," he whispered, voice trembling. "You found us a way out." The horse snorted softly, lowering his head as if bowing to the earth. Henry gathered what he could and packed it into an old canvas bag. When he stood, he noticed something carved faintly into a nearby rock. A number, half erased by time. 1881, the year of the mining rush. He realized then that he wasn't the first to stand here in wonder. Someone before him had chased the same dream. Someone who might have lost everything to it. The wind shifted, and a chill crept down his spine. Still, he couldn't turn away. Back home, he cleaned the pieces carefully under the weak kitchen light. They were heavier than they looked, cold and solid in his palm. Ben came down the stairs, rubbing his eyes. "Dad? What are you doing?" Henry froze. Then quietly, he set one of the pieces on the table. "Look at this." Ben stepped closer, disbelief spreading across his face. "Is that silver?" Henry nodded. "Found it out by the ridge. There's more where this came from." For a moment, they just stared at each other. Two men caught between hope and fear. Then Ben broke into a shaky grin. "You're serious? This could pay off everything. The home mortgage, the ranch?" Henry raised a hand. "Easy, son. We don't know yet what we're dealing with." But inside, the fire had already started to burn. By dawn, Henry had written a list. Supplies he'd need. Tools, a plan. He could almost see Martha smiling from the picture on the mantel. For the first time, the future didn't feel like a closed door. It felt wide open. That day, he rode into town with Ben. They stopped at the hardware store, bought gloves, rope, a few lanterns. People nodded politely, unaware that the man buying mining gear might be holding a fortune's first spark. Ben couldn't stop talking. "We could fix up the barn, maybe even get the tractor running again. Hell, we could—" Henry smiled faintly but didn't answer. Hope was dangerous. He'd seen what it could do to a man who forgot to be careful. Still, he let his son dream. It had been too long since he'd heard that kind of laughter. On the way back, Rust trotted ahead, mane whipping in the wind. The ridge gleamed in the distance, like a promise. That night, Henry couldn't sleep. He stood by the window, watching the desert breathe under the moonlight. Every part of him ached to believe this was real, that the land he'd loved and nearly lost was finally giving something back. He whispered a quiet prayer, not for wealth, but for wisdom. Because sometimes the hardest part of a miracle isn't finding it. It's knowing what to do once you have. Outside, Rust raised his head and whinnied softly toward the canyon. The sound rolled through the night, low and haunting, like a warning carried on the wind. Henry didn't understand it yet, but the desert was already changing him, one heartbeat at a time. For the first time in months, the sun didn't look like an enemy. It spilled across the ranch like a benediction, warming the tin roof, painting the old barn in soft gold. Henry stepped outside with a thermos of coffee and a list of plans written in shaky pencil. The air smelled faintly of cut hay and morning dust. For once, even the silence felt kind. Ben was already by the fence, hammering loose boards back into place. His movements were sharp and eager, a rhythm Henry hadn't seen in the boy since before Martha died. Rust grazed nearby, his ears twitching every time the hammer struck. The sound seemed to echo with purpose. "Careful with that," Henry called. Ben grinned without looking up. "Guess I'm not bad with a hammer, huh?" "Not bad," Henry admitted. "You take after your mother." It had been years since they'd spoken of her without the air turning heavy. Today, it didn't hurt as much. Maybe hope was good medicine after all. When the chores were done, they saddled Rust and packed shovels, canvas bags, and a couple of canteens. The desert shimmered ahead of them, the canyon glowing like a secret waiting to be told. By noon, they reached the hollow where Henry had found the first pieces. The heat pressed down like a hand, but neither of them cared. They dug together, Ben's laughter rising each time a new glint of silver flashed in the dirt. "Dad, this is it," he said breathlessly. "We're gonna save everything." Henry looked at the ore glittering in Ben's hands and saw the same wild belief that had once burned in his own eyes. "Easy, son," he said softly. "We'll take it slow. No sense losing our heads." But inside, he felt the rush, too. The possibility that every sleepless night, every bill, every prayer might finally have meant something. As the sun sank behind the ridge, they packed up their small treasure. The weight of the bags felt like redemption. They rode home through the violet dusk, wind cool on their faces. The land no longer seemed cruel. It felt alive. That night, Ben couldn't stop talking. "We could pay off the debt, fix up the roof, maybe even get new cattle. You ever think about expanding? Maybe turning the ranch into something bigger, an investment for the future?" Henry smiled, faintly. "One step at a time, boy. Come on, Dad. Don't you ever dream anymore?" Henry hesitated. The truth was, he hadn't allowed himself to dream in years. But seeing Ben's face, his mother's spirit flickering behind those blue eyes, something inside him began to loosen. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Maybe I do." Later, after Ben had gone to bed, Henry sat by the window, rolling a piece of ore between his fingers. In the lamplight, it gleamed faintly, like a living thing. He set it beside Martha's Bible, right on top of the foreclosure notice. He whispered, "You see, Martha, we might just make it." The next morning, he rode into town to see Mayor Mary Jacobs. She was a strong woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Henry laid the small pieces of silver on her desk. "I found these," he said simply. "Out by the ridge. Thought you should know." Mary studied the ore, then looked at him. "You understand what this means?" Henry nodded. "Could mean salvation. Could mean trouble. Or both." She leaned back. "Word like this gets out, you'll have prospectors, buyers, the bank, all knocking on your door. You need to move careful, Henry. Promise me that." He met her eyes. "I just want to keep my land. I ain't looking to get rich." Mary smiled sadly. "That's what all good men say, until the silver starts talking louder than their conscience." Her words stayed with him on the long ride home. The desert shimmered around him, silent and watching. When he reached the ranch, Ben was waiting at the gate, holding a piece of paper. "The bank called again," he said. "They want to reevaluate the property." Henry took the paper, his stomach tightening. "Did they say why?" Ben shrugged. "Guess they heard rumors." Henry turned toward the canyon in the distance, its red walls glowing under the sinking sun. Hope still burned in his chest, but now it flickered with unease. The desert had given him something precious, but he could feel it asking for something back. That night, the wind howled across the plains. Rust paced restlessly in the corral, hooves striking the dirt like a heartbeat. Inside, Henry sat awake, staring at the silver on the table. It caught the firelight and threw it back, cold, sharp, beautiful. He couldn't tell if it looked more like salvation or temptation. He whispered into the dark, "If this is a blessing, Lord, help me not to ruin it." Outside, Rust let out a low whinny that rolled into the night, echoing off the ridge. It sounded almost like an answer. By the end of the week, Virginia City was humming with rumors. They started as faint murmurs in the feed store, then rolled like tumbleweed through the diner, the church steps, the post office. "Cole struck silver," someone said. "Right on his own land. Could be worth a fortune." Henry felt the weight of every whisper before he even stepped into town. Eyes followed him, down Main Street, half curious, half hungry. He tipped his hat politely, trying to pretend nothing had changed. But something had. The air itself seemed to buzz with suspicion. He went to the hardware store for nails and kerosene. The clerk, normally chatty, went quiet when he entered. Behind the counter, a radio droned faintly about home loan rates and new investment opportunities in Nevada mining. The irony wasn't lost on him. When he paid for his things, the clerk cleared his throat. "Heard you've been digging again out by the ridge?" Henry looked up slowly. "I've been working my land, same as always." The clerk smiled thinly. "Sure you have. Just remember, folks get jumpy when money shows up where it don't belong." Henry's jaw tightened. He left without another word, but the warning clung to him all the way home. At the ranch, Ben was in the barn sorting tools. He looked up eagerly when Henry returned. "How'd it go?" Henry dropped the bag of supplies onto the workbench. "People are talking. Too much." Ben frowned. "So what? Let 'em. It's not illegal to find silver on your own property." Henry didn't answer. He stared out toward the horizon, where the canyon shimmered faintly in the afternoon heat. "Things like this. They change people, son. Fast." Ben scoffed. "We finally catch a break and you want to hide it?" "I want to keep us safe," Henry said quietly. "That's not the same thing." The boy turned away, shoulders tight. "Maybe you're just scared to win for once." Henry didn't respond. Rust shifted uneasily in his stall, sensing the tension. The barn filled with silence, the heavy kind that made even the dust hang still. That evening, a car pulled up to the gate. A man in a suit stepped out, his shoes kicking up small clouds of red dirt. He introduced himself as Daniel Reed, a representative from the bank. "Mr. Cole," he said smoothly, "mind if I have a moment?" Henry led him to the porch. The man's eyes were sharp, calculating. "We've heard talk of a possible mineral discovery on your property. If true, it could significantly affect your land's mortgage valuation." Henry folded his arms. "And what if it's just talk?" "Then you've got nothing to worry about," Reed replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But if it isn't, the bank will need to review ownership rights and potential royalties. You wouldn't want to violate state mining codes, would you? The implication hung between them like a blade. Henry kept his voice steady. This land's been coal property since before the war. Whatever's under it stays ours. Reed nodded, still smiling. Of course. Just be careful who you share things with, Mr. Cole. Nevada has a way of chewing up men who think they can outsmart her. When the car disappeared down the dusty road, Henry stood for a long time, watching the dust settle. He felt both proud and frightened. The silver had given him hope, but now it carried the scent of danger. That night, he found Ben sitting by the fence, tossing pebbles into the dirt. "Bank sent a man today," Henry said. Ben's head snapped up. "What? Why?" "They know," Ben cursed under his breath. "What are we going to do?" Henry looked toward Rust, standing still beneath the moonlight. The horse turned his head slightly, as if listening. "We're going to be careful," he said. "And we're going to keep this between us." Ben hesitated, then nodded. "You think Mom would have wanted that?" Henry smiled faintly. "Your mother would have wanted us to keep the land. Everything else is noise." They sat in silence for a long while, listening to the crickets hum and the wind sweep across the plains. The desert looked calm, almost peaceful, but Henry knew better. Beneath that stillness, the ground was shifting. He rose and dusted off his jeans. "Get some rest, son. Tomorrow we start early." As he walked back to the house, he caught a faint reflection at the edge of the corral, a shimmer in the dirt, like moonlight caught in motion. Rust pawed the ground once, softly, then stilled. Henry paused, heart tightening. He wasn't sure anymore if the land was giving him a blessing or warning him to let go. But when he looked up at the stars, their cold brilliance reminded him of silver, of Martha's eyes, of the promise he'd made. He whispered into the wind, "I'll keep it safe, no matter what." Somewhere far off, thunder rolled across the desert, soft but steady, like a threat waiting to be born. The sky over Nevada had turned the color of old steel. By noon, the wind carried grit sharp enough to sting, and Rust paced the corral, nostrils flaring, uneasy. Henry watched the horizon darken, the kind of storm that didn't just pass. It swallowed the desert whole. Ben came out of the barn, wiping sweat from his brow. "You seeing that?" Henry nodded. "Storm's coming fast." They hurried to tie down loose boards, shut the shutters, and pull the animals into shelter. The air was thick with electricity. The scent of dust and ozone clung to everything. As Henry latched the final gate, he noticed the first streak of lightning rip across the canyon ridge. The echo came seconds later, deep and hollow, shaking the earth. Inside, the wind rattled the tin roof like a drum. Ben stood by the window, restless. "We should have stayed quiet, Dad. This feels like a warning." Henry poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs, his hands steady despite the roar outside. "Storms come and go. What matters is what's left after." But when he looked out the window again, something strange caught his eye. Rust wasn't in the barn. "Damn it," he muttered, setting the mug down. "Where's Rust?" Ben asked. Henry didn't answer. He was already pulling on his coat. The wind slammed into him the moment he stepped outside, a wall of dust and sand, and could barely see 10 feet ahead. "Dad!" Ben shouted from the doorway. "Stay inside," Henry yelled back. "I'll bring him in." He stumbled toward the corral, head down against the wind. The world had turned to chaos, sand slicing his face, sky split by lightning. Somewhere in the noise, he heard it. A faint, desperate whinny. "Rust!" He followed the sound, half blind, until a shape emerged through the dust. The horse stood near the ridge, fighting the wind, its coat ghostly under the flashes of light. Henry grabbed the reins, shouting over the storm. "What are you doing out here, boy?" Rust jerked his head toward the canyon. Even in the fury of the storm, he seemed drawn there. Urgent, insistent. Henry hesitated. "Not now," he muttered. "We'll come back after." But Rust reared, eyes wide, hooves striking the dirt. Lightning flashed, and for an instant Henry saw the ground split open near the canyon's edge, a small collapse, revealing a glimmer deep below. Silver. The storm screamed around him, sand slicing like glass. For a moment Henry stood frozen, torn between fear and awe. Then he yanked the reins, forcing Rust back toward home. "Not tonight. Not like this." They stumbled into the barn just as the worst of the storm hit. Ben ran to them, slamming the doors shut. Thunder rolled overhead, rattling every nail in the wood. "You could have died," Ben shouted. Henry wiped his face with his sleeve. "Rust was out there." "You risked your life for a horse?" Henry turned to him, eyes hard. "He's not just a horse. He saved us once. He'll do it again." Ben stared, disbelief etched across his face. "You sound crazy. That silver's making you crazy." Henry stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "You think I care about the silver? I care about what it means. This land, it's talking to us. You just don't want to listen." Ben shook his head. "No, I'm done listening. You can have your dirt and your ghosts. I'm done." He stormed out into the next room, slamming the door. Henry sank onto a bale of hay, hands trembling. The wind howled through the cracks like a choir of lost souls. Rust stood nearby, sides heaving, eyes calm again now that they were safe. Henry looked at him and whispered, "You were trying to show me something, weren't you?" The horse lowered his head, pressing his muzzle lightly to Henry's shoulder. It was a gesture of comfort, but also of reminder. Hours passed before the storm began to fade. The first rays of dawn broke through torn clouds, revealing a world changed. Fences down, the yard flooded with red mud, and the desert beyond carved anew by the rain. Henry stepped outside, boots sinking into the wet earth. In the distance, the canyon gleamed faintly where the lightning had struck. He could see it now. A small opening in the ridge, darker than before. Something was waiting there, patient as time. He exhaled, slow and heavy. "You win, boy," he murmured. "We'll go back." Inside, Ben was asleep on the couch, arms crossed, jaw tight even in rest. Henry pulled a blanket over him, then stood by the window, watching the sun struggle through the last clouds. He thought about everything the storm could have taken, and everything it might have given. The desert had tested him before. But this time, it felt like it was watching, measuring the weight of his faith. He reached down and touched Rust's mane through the open stall door. "Guess we're not done yet," he whispered. Outside, the wind carried away the last traces of the storm, leaving behind the scent of wet earth and something faintly metallic. It smelled like renewal, or maybe like warning. The storm left the world rinsed and raw. Puddles the color of rust pooled in the ruts by the barn, and the first clean light of morning clung to the fences like silk. Henry stood at the window a long time, listening to the drip from the eaves, the tired creak of wood settling after a long night. Somewhere behind him, Ben stirred on the couch, a blanket crooked at his waist, the boy's jaw still clenched like he'd fallen asleep mid-argument. Henry set a kettle on the stove and waited for the water to think about boiling. The quiet was a weight, but it wasn't the kind that crushed. It pressed the truth to the surface. He took Martha's Bible from the shelf, opened it to where the foreclosure notice had once been tucked, then closed it again, palms flat on the worn cover. The kettle finally sighed. He poured 2 mugs and crossed the room. "Morning," Ben said, voice gravelly. "Morning," Henry answered, offering the cup. Ben took it, eyes searching his father's face. "You went out there," he said. Not a question. "I did." Henry looked past him to the window, where the canyon cut a dark mouth into the bright horizon. "Storm peeled a little more off the ridge. There's an opening now. Real one." Ben sat up, blanket sliding to the floor. "So we go back today. We check it out." Henry didn't answer fast enough. "What?" Ben pressed. Henry sat on the edge of the chair opposite. He felt the ache in his shoulders, the old stiffness in his hands, his body a ledger of debts and late payments life had written in bone. "I need you to understand something before we take another step," he said. "I need you to hear me all the way through." Ben nodded cautiously. Henry drew a breath. "I'm not chasing a windfall. Not silver, not the kind of money that turns neighbors into strangers. I made your mother a promise on that hill. You know that. But I don't think I ever told you what the promise felt like." He glanced toward the small mesquite beyond the window, its damp leaves trembling. "It felt like a hand on my back when I couldn't stand. Like, even if everything else failed, we'd keep the land so you'd have something solid to start from. Not cash, not luck, just a place to belong." Ben shifted, eyes lowering to the mug. "Dad, I get it. But that's silver. I know what it could do," Henry said softly. "It could pay off the mortgage. It could buy time. Might even top off a little college fund, if that's still in you. It could keep a roof tight, without me begging for mortgage refinance I can't afford. But there's another side to it. It could take what it gives if we let it speak louder than we do." Ben's gaze lifted. Something gentler had come into it. "You think I don't see that?" "I think you want me to win so bad you'd let me lose in another way." Henry set his mug down. "Last night, when the wind hit, I went after Rust. You were right to be mad. But when he pulled toward that ridge, I saw a flash, like the ground itself breathing light. I thought it was a sign. Then I thought it might be a trap. Maybe both. I ain't a superstitious man, Ben, but I believe in what storms show us." They sat with that a while. Outside, the day brightened as if reconsidering itself. Rust's shadow moved across the yard. Calm now, his ears forward, his steps careful on the soft ground. Ben rubbed his forearm, a nervous habit he'd had since he was little. "What are you saying, Dad?" Henry stood, walked to the door, and opened it. Fresh air slipped in. Wet sage, clean earth, a faint metallic tang. He spoke without turning. "I'm saying we go back together. But before we take a single piece out of that ground, we decide what it's for. Not toys, not pride. We'll pay what we owe. We'll fix what's broken. We'll set aside enough for a retirement savings cushion so this place don't rise and fall with my back. And if there's more after that," he paused, "we make sure it helps more than just our mailbox." Ben blinked. "You mean the town?" Henry finally faced him. Mary's been fighting for folks like us a long time. There's men and women one letter away from losing their lives' work. If that ridge holds what I think it does, maybe our first real investment is in the ground we share. Fences, water lines, feed subsidies through winter. Call it family insurance if that makes it easier to swallow. We use what we found like a tool, not a trophy. Ben's mouth softened, a boy's stubbornness finding room to turn. Mom would have liked that, he said. She used to say the town's just an extension of the kitchen table. Henry smiled, tired and tender. She did. Ben set the mug aside and stood. I'm sorry about last night, he said. I keep thinking if we just go faster, we can outrun everything. He gestured toward the window. Bills, sky, history. But maybe that's not the way. It ain't, Henry said. We move like rain after drought, slow enough to sink in. Rust's hoof tapped once in the yard. A soft, patient knock. They stepped outside. The mud swallowed their boot prints, leaving shallow crescents that filled with water and reflected the blown blue sky. Rust came to them, muzzle damp, mane tangled from the night. He pressed his head against Henry's chest, then turned to Ben and did the same, a small benediction bestowed without ceremony. You were right, old boy, Henry whispered into the dark velvet of the horse's cheek. You were showing the way, not the prize. They saddled up without rush. The air had that quiet after-story feeling, like the land had told them what they needed and now waited to see if they'd listened. As they rode toward the ridge, the desert opened like a page being turned. Sunlight kindled in the pooled water, each puddle a small sky. At the canyon, the storm's work was plain. A slice of wall had sloughed away, revealing a darker seam within the red, stone gone black with time, and a whisper of luster running through it like a vein. Henry dismounted and put a palm to the rock. It was cooler than the air, as if some old season had been stored inside it. No picking yet, he said, glancing at Ben. We'll map it. Mark what's safe. We'll take ore only from surface fall. We'll keep records. And we don't brag. Not to friends, not to strangers. The first man who uses silver to buy a bigger voice is the first man who loses his own. Ben nodded once, solemn. They worked in the hush of mid-morning, notes in a small weatherproof book, chalk marks on stone, samples lifted carefully from the loosened edge. Rust stood at the mouth of the hollow, watching like a sentry. Now and then he pawed the damp earth and snorted, as if reminding them to keep their focus where it mattered. By noon, they had a neat canvas sack of small pieces, nothing showy, just proof. Henry held the drawstring a moment longer than he needed to, then tied it off and tucked it into the saddlebag like a promise sealed. On the way home, Ben rode close. Dad? When we pay the bank, can we take Martha's Bible back up the hill and, put something else in it? Henry glanced over. Like what? Ben thought. A list of names, folks we plan to help, so it's not just about us. Henry swallowed. Sunlight flashed on the wet rim of the world, a bright ring around the day. Yeah, he said. I like that. They reached the ranch as clouds regrouped in the high distance, white sails on a calmer sea. Henry unsaddled Rust, brushed the dried mud from his coat, and checked each hoof the way Martha used to insist, carefully, as if the animal were a signed contract with grace. Rust rested his muzzle against Henry's shoulder and breathed long and slow, easing something still knotted in the man's chest. Inside, Henry laid the canvas sack on the table. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. Ben pulled out a folded sheet of paper and a pencil. Okay, he said, a little shy, a little brave. Let's write that list. Henry watched his son write Coal Ranch at the top. Then, beneath it, spaces waiting for the town's names. The house felt bigger somehow, as if a wall had been nudged outward to make room for hope that wasn't just theirs. Before we start, Henry said, one more thing. He reached for a clean envelope and scrawled 2 words across the front. For the land. He slid the sack against it, not quite touching. Every dollar that comes from that canyon has to answer to this. If it doesn't, we put it back. Ben smiled, not the reckless grin of a lucky boy, but the steady smile of a young man who'd learned what to guard. Deal. Evening came soft, without drama. The wind moved through the mesquite with a sound like pages turning. Out in the yard, puddles surrendered their borrowed skies back to the lengthening blue. Rust stood by the fence, head lowered, breathing in rhythm with the quiet. Henry lit the lamp, and for the first time in a long time, didn't feel like he was fighting the dark. He felt like he was keeping a promise. One to Martha, one to Ben, and one to the ground that had carried them all this way. When the light steadied, he said into the simple room, "Tomorrow, we talk to Mary." And just like that, the path ahead took shape, not as a road of silver, but as a road of choices. Morning came cool and bright, the kind that feels like the desert is offering an apology after a long night. The air still smelled faintly of rain and iron. Henry saddled Rust before the sun climbed high, his movements slow and deliberate, the way a man does when he knows every step matters. Ben stepped out of the house holding the envelope they had written on the night before. For the land. He tucked it carefully into his father's saddlebag. "You sure you want to talk to Mary first thing?" Henry nodded. "If I don't, somebody else will talk for me. Better she hears it from my mouth than from the bank." The ride into town was quiet. The horizon shimmered pale gold, dotted with sagebrush still heavy from the storm. Rust's hooves left soft prints in the damp sand. Every few miles, Henry would glance at his son, riding slightly ahead, shoulders squared in that new way of his, half boy, half man. When they reached Virginia City, Main Street was just waking up. Men swept the boardwalks, and the smell of coffee and frying bacon drifted from the diner. Henry dismounted outside the mayor's office, dusted off his hat, and squared his shoulders. "Stay with Rust," he told Ben. "This won't take long." Inside, Mary Jacobs looked up from a stack of papers. Her silver hair was pulled back, her reading glasses low on her nose. "Henry Cole," she said. "I heard you survived that storm. Sit down before you fall down." Henry smiled faintly and took the chair opposite her. The room was quiet except for the hum of the ceiling fan. He laid the envelope on the desk. "That's what we talked about, the silver. I've got proof now. But before any lawyers or bankers start sniffing, I want to make this right. Legal. Honest." Mary raised an eyebrow. "You mean you want to register it?" "Partly," Henry said. "But mostly I want to make sure whatever comes out of that canyon doesn't turn this town into a fight. We use it to pay our debts, sure. After that, we help others keep their land. You can call it a community fund if you want, maybe even a rural investment plan." Mary leaned back, watching him for a long moment. "You realize what you're saying? You're offering up what could make you rich." Henry shrugged. "Money's just another kind of drought. It runs out when you depend on it too much. I want to leave Ben something that doesn't dry up. Mary's voice softened. Your wife would be proud. Henry smiled, a little sadly. That's the idea. She slid the envelope toward herself, tapping it with one finger. You trust me with this? I trust you to keep this town from eating itself alive. Mary nodded slowly. Then we'll set it up. Quietly. I'll draw the paperwork, put it under agricultural development. We'll call it the Coal Grant. Sound fair? Fair enough. When he stepped back outside, Ben was feeding Rust an apple, the sunlight catching the horse's mane like a bronze flame. Henry mounted up, feeling a small, solid peace he hadn't felt in years, the kind that comes not from winning, but from choosing. Everything okay? Ben asked as they rode out of town. Better than okay, Henry said. We did the right thing. Ben smiled. Guess we're businessmen now. Henry laughed. If that's what they call men who don't want to be greedy. They reached the ridge again by mid-afternoon. The ground was dry now, the storm's scars fading into the color of the land. Henry dismounted and stood for a moment, hat in hand, looking out across the wide expanse. You know, he said, your mother used to say the desert keeps secrets until you earn 'em. I think we've earned this one. Ben nodded. So what happens next? Henry turned to him. Next, we make sure this doesn't end with us. They spent the rest of the day measuring, marking, noting safe paths down to the new vein. Ben took careful notes in his small ledger. Every so often, Rust would lift his head toward the horizon, ears twitching. Henry would follow his gaze, half expecting another storm, but the sky stayed wide and open, blue enough to make a man believe in forgiveness. When the sun dipped low, they started home. The world glowed red and gold, the same colors that had once meant struggle, but now felt like promise. At the ranch, Henry unhitched Rust and turned him loose into the paddock. The horse shook his mane, the evening light flickering across his coat like fire through copper. Inside, Ben lit the lamp while Henry sat at the kitchen table, writing names. Families he knew were hurting. The Harpers, the Jimenez brothers. Old man Clay, who'd lost his water rights. We'll start here, Henry said. If there's more, we'll add to it. Ben looked over his shoulder. You really think people will believe us? Henry paused. They don't have to believe us. They just have to see what we do. That night, long after Ben had gone to bed, Henry stepped outside again. The stars were out in full, clean, sharp, endless. Rust stood by the fence, head bowed, as if listening to something only he could hear. Henry walked over, resting a hand on the horse's neck. You've been right every time, old friend, he whispered. And if I'm right now, maybe this is what you were leading me to all along. Not a mine, but a way back to what matters. Rust lifted his head, eyes catching starlight. In them, Henry saw the reflection of the open sky. And maybe, just maybe, the reflection of his own peace. Behind him, the light in the kitchen still burned, soft and steady. It wasn't wealth that filled the house, it was purpose. Henry exhaled, slow and grateful. Tomorrow, he would bring the first samples to Mary for appraisal. The day after, he'd start calling the families on his list. For tonight, he just stood there under the stars, hand resting on Rust's shoulder, both of them breathing the same quiet rhythm of men who'd learned to trust the land again. When the first trucks rolled into the coal ranch, their engines rumbled like a new kind of thunder. They weren't from the bank this time. They carried men from town, farmers, mechanics, school teachers, faces Henry had known his whole life. They came because of a letter Mayor Mary had sent, a simple notice pinned outside the post office. The Cole Grant, a community effort to preserve local farms. Volunteers welcome. By noon, the yard was alive. Shovels clinked against rock. Hammers beat a rhythm against old timber. Women brought coffee and sandwiches. Children ran between the trucks, laughing. The same desert that once held only silence now hummed with life. Henry stood on the porch, watching, his chest full of something both heavy and bright. Ben walked beside him, wiping sweat from his neck. "Did you ever think we'd see this place full again?" "Not like this," Henry said quietly. "But it feels right." He watched as Rust moved through the crowd, calm and steady, pausing now and then as if inspecting their work. The horse had become something of a legend already, the one that found the silver. Someone had even painted his name on a sign at the gate. Henry had laughed when he saw it, but deep down, he didn't mind. Rust deserved it. The townsfolk worked carefully, following the safety lines Henry and Ben had mapped out. No greed, no rush, just hands working together. Every bag of ore was tagged, weighed, and recorded under the coal fund. Mary's system ensured the profits would first pay off the mortgages of local farms, including Henry's, then go into rebuilding community wells and barns, destroyed by the last dry season. It was slow work, honest work, the kind that felt more valuable than the silver itself. At sunset, when the ridge glowed red and gold, Mary arrived in her old pickup. She waved Henry over, holding a clipboard. "First load's going to the refinery next week," she said. "Once it's processed, the fund will start to grow. We've even got investors from Carson City asking about sustainable resource programs. You might have started something bigger than you think." Henry smiled. "Then let's keep it clean. No outsiders telling us how to use what's ours." Mary nodded. "Already written into the charter. Local ownership only." They stood side by side, looking out over the canyon. The workers' laughter floated through the cooling air. It was the kind of sound the desert rarely heard. Hope, spoken aloud. Ben came running up, dirt streaked across his face, eyes bright. "Dad, they found another seam, shallow, just past the ridge." Henry followed him down to where the others had gathered. In the fading light, he saw it. A narrow vein of silver, exposed by the last rainfall, glittering like frozen lightning in the rock. He crouched, touched the surface, and felt a strange calm settle over him. "This isn't luck," he said softly. "This is the land finally trusting us back." A man nearby laughed. "Well, let's keep her trusting then." The group worked until darkness fell, then gathered by the campfire Mary's team had built. Someone strummed a guitar. The sound drifted across the open plain, soft and low. Ben passed his father a tin cup of coffee. "We did it," he said. Henry looked around. The faces, the firelight, Rust standing quietly beyond the glow. "No, son," he said. "We're just starting." He leaned back on his elbows, staring up at the stars. For years they had looked cold to him, unreachable. Tonight they looked closer, almost kind. By the next morning, word of the coal fund spread beyond Virginia City. Local news crews came to film the story, an aging rancher and his horse leading a town out of debt. Henry didn't like the cameras, but he knew their value. The exposure brought support from nearby counties, donations, equipment, even offers of farm insurance subsidies from state programs. Still, he kept the focus small. "We don't need heroes," he told one reporter. "We just need neighbors." Ben teased him later. You looked good on camera, old man. Could have been a politician. Henry chuckled. Only thing I'm running for is another day of peace. Over the weeks, the silver continued to flow, not in heaps, but in steady, modest yields, enough to keep the fund alive, to pay off loans, to repair barns. Families that once faced foreclosure now had roofs again, animals again, mornings again. The town began to breathe. One evening, as they balanced the ledgers in Mary's office, she said, "You realize you could have kept it, all. No one would have blamed you." Henry smiled faintly. Maybe. But I'd have lost more than the ranch. I'd have lost the reason I wanted to save it. Outside, Rust waited by the hitching post, watching the last of the sunset bleed away. Ben mounted first, then Henry. They rode home slow, the night air cool and full of cicadas. Halfway down the road, Ben said, "You think Mom can see all this?" Henry looked up at the sky. "If she can't, she's missing one hell of a view." They reached the ranch long after dark. Henry dismounted, patted Rust's neck, and whispered, "Good work, partner." The horse flicked an ear, eyes glinting in the moonlight. Inside the house, the lamp on the table still burned beside the list they'd written. Several names were now crossed out. Debts paid, lives steadied. Henry picked up the pencil and added one more line at the bottom. Virginia City, whole. He smiled. For the first time in years, the word whole felt real. As he blew out the lamp, the moonlight flooded through the window, silver and soft, resting across the Bible on the mantel. The land was quiet again, but it wasn't empty. It was full of promise, of people, of gratitude. By autumn, Virginia City didn't look like the same town. The once quiet streets buzzed again, fresh paint on the storefronts, new roofs glinting under the Nevada sun, the smell of coffee and hot bread spilling from the diner every morning. The coal fund had done what no loan or politician ever could. It gave people permission to hope. Mayor Mary called it the Silver Festival, a day to celebrate the town's rebirth. She said it would remind everyone that wealth was only as good as the hands it passed through. Henry didn't much care for speeches or banners, but he understood the need. A community needed symbols as much as it needed fences. The festival began with music. Fiddles, banjos, laughter rising between the brick buildings. Children chased one another, waving ribbons of silver paper that flashed like tiny comets. Ben helped set up tables near the courthouse, his shirt sleeves rolled high, dust on his arms. Henry watched him from the edge of the crowd, pride warming the quiet spaces inside him. Rust was there too, of course, brushed clean, his coat shining a deep, burnished copper. Someone had tied a soft garland of wild sage around his neck. People stopped to pet him, snapping photos for local news. Henry leaned on the fence, amused. "You're famous now, old boy," he murmured. "Better not let it go to your head." At noon, Mary took the stage. Her voice carried steady through the air. "Years ago, this town was built on silver. Then it dried up. But it wasn't the metal that made us rich. It was grit. It was neighbors. Henry Cole reminded us of that." The crowd turned, applauding. Henry shifted, uncomfortable under the attention. Ben nudged him. "Go on," he whispered. "Say something." Henry shook his head, but Mary was already calling him forward. He stepped onto the small wooden platform. The applause softened to a hush. For a moment, he couldn't find his words. Then he looked out at the faces, lined, sunburned, familiar, and the words came easy. "I've spent most of my life thinking land was something you own," he began. "Turns out it owns you back, if you treat it right. I used to pray for a miracle, and when one showed up, I near ruined it by thinking it was meant for me alone. But this land, it don't belong to one man. It belongs to whoever's willing to work it honest and pass it on better than he found it." He paused. Rust stamped a hoof softly, as if agreeing. The crowd chuckled. Henry smiled. "So if you want to thank someone, thank the ground under your boots. And thank that horse over there. He's the real one who found the treasure." Laughter rippled through the square. Mary wiped a tear discreetly before stepping back to the microphone. "Let's honor that treasure then, the kind we can all share." She gestured, and two boys pulled a cloth from the statue that had been covered near the fountain. Underneath stood a bronze figure, a horse with its head bowed, one hoof lifted, eyes turned toward the horizon. Beneath it, a plaque read, "To the hands that keep the land alive." Ben stood beside his father, speechless. "They made it look just like rust," he whispered. Henry's throat tightened. "Close enough," he said, voice rough. The band struck up again, and people began to dance. Couples spun in the street. Children ran circles around the statue. For a while, Henry just watched, feeling the rhythm pulse through the town like a heartbeat rediscovered. Later that evening, after the music slowed and lanterns glowed soft against the walls, Mary approached Henry with a folded document. "The refinery reports came in," she said. "Enough to pay off the last of your loan, and most of Clay's water debts, too. After that, the fund keeps growing." Henry took the paper, but didn't open it. "That's your doing, Mary." She smiled. "No, it's yours. You started this because you chose generosity over fear. People notice when a man does that. Makes them braver." He nodded, eyes shining faintly in the lamplight. "Bravery's easier when you've got good folks watching your back." Ben joined them, a ribbon of silver still tied around his wrist. "They want us for one last picture by the statue," he said. Henry glanced at Rust, who stood a little apart from the crowd, calm as ever. "Let's not keep 'em waitin'." The photographer lined them up, father, son, horse, and the mayor, under the flickering string lights. As the flash burst, Henry caught a glimpse of Martha in his mind's eye, smiling from the edge of the crowd, proud and peaceful. The image lingered long after the light faded. When the festival finally wound down, the streets glowed with lanterns swaying in the warm night wind. People walked home arm in arm, carrying leftover pie, their laughter echoing down the alleys. Henry and Ben led Rust back toward the ranch. The road shimmered under the moon, pale and quiet again. "Feels strange," Ben said. "Like the end of something." Henry shook his head. "Not the end. Just the part where we learn to live without fighting the world." They reached the gate and stopped. From there, they could see the faint outline of the canyon, silvered under the starlight. Henry rested a hand on Rust's neck. "You brought us home, partner," he said softly. "All of us." Rust flicked an ear and leaned against him, the simple gesture saying everything that words couldn't. Inside the house, the Bible still sat on the mantel. Henry opened it and slid the refinery papers inside, not as a record of wealth, but as a reminder of grace. On the opposite page, Ben had written new names, families the fund had already helped. The lamp burned low. Father and son sat in the quiet, a long time, neither needing to speak. The night outside breathed easy, the desert at peace. For the first time in a lifetime, Henry Cole had nothing left to fear, only something to tend, something to leave behind. The desert always kept its promises in silence. When the night lifted, the land exhaled light, soft and gold at first, then deepening into that rose-colored glow that only Nevada mornings could make. Henry Cole saddled Rust before sunrise, moving with the quiet patience of a man who had learned what to take from the world and what to leave behind. Ben met him at the gate, hands in his jacket pockets, hair tousled from sleep. "You're heading out early," he said. Henry smiled. "Old habit. Figured I'd ride up to the ridge one more time before the day starts. Check the fences, maybe say thank you." Ben nodded, understanding without asking. "Mind if I come?" Henry shook his head. "No, son. This one's just between me and him." He nodded toward Rust, who pawed at the dirt as if eager to go. The sun was still low when they reached the canyon. The air shimmered cool and sweet after the long night. Rust climbed slow, steady, his hooves brushing stones that glittered faintly in the dawn light. From the ridge, the land opened wide, fields dotted with new roofs, water tanks shining, roads smoothed again. Henry could see smoke rising from kitchens, thin trails curling into the sky. The town was awake, alive, and that was all the reward he needed. He dismounted and let Rust wander a few paces ahead. The horse turned his head toward the east, where the first true blaze of sunlight struck the red cliffs. For a moment, everything, the rocks, the dust, even the small silver seams, glowed as if lit from within. Henry removed his hat and held it against his chest. "Martha," he said softly, "you kept your word, and so did I." The wind lifted, gentle, carrying the scent of sage and the far-off sound of morning. Bells from town. Rust lowered his head and pressed his muzzle to Henry's shoulder, that old gesture they both understood. It was their way of closing a chapter. Henry reached into his saddlebag and took out the small ledger Ben had been keeping. He flipped through pages filled with names, notes, amounts paid off. Harper's, Clay, Jimenez. At the end, there was one more line written in Ben's neat hand. "The Cole Ranch, paid in full." He smiled, folded the book, and tucked it beneath a stone near the canyon's edge. "Some things ought to stay here," he whispered. "Let the land keep its own records." The sun rose higher. Down below, the town looked washed in light, every rooftop a tiny mirror. Henry mounted up, gave Rust's neck a soft pat. "Come on, partner. Time to head home." They rode slow, through the familiar dust, the rhythm of hooves like an old lullaby. Halfway down the trail, Henry turned once more to look back. The canyon gleamed with a pale, metallic glow, not from the silver veins but from the sunlight itself, spilling across the red rock like molten promise. When they reached the ranch, Ben was waiting by the corral. He had 2 mugs of coffee steaming on the fence post. Henry swung down, joints creaking, and took one. They stood in silence, watching the light crawl over the land. "You get what you came for?" Ben asked. Henry smiled. "I think I did. Turns out it wasn't silver after all." Ben grinned. "No? Then what was it?" "Faith," Henry said simply. "And maybe a little peace." They both laughed quietly, the sound easy, unforced. Rust leaned his head over the fence, brushing against Ben's arm, and the boy reached up to scratch the horse's neck. The gesture was small, but full of everything that mattered. The bond that had held them through loss, through pride, through the slow, hard return to grace. As the sun climbed, townsfolk began to appear on the road, wagons carrying lumber, a few kids waving as they passed. The air hummed with the steady promise of ordinary life. Henry breathed it in deeply. After years of drought, silence, and fear, this ordinary felt sacred. Later that morning, Mary arrived in her truck. She leaned out the window and called, "You two still standing around like you ain't saved half the county?" Henry chuckled. "Just taking a minute to let it sink in." She climbed down, handed him a sealed envelope. "Final paperwork. You're officially free. Ranch title's clean." Henry opened it, looked at the stamped seal. For a moment he didn't speak. Then he handed it to Ben. "Put this somewhere safe. Maybe in your mother's Bible." Mary smiled. "You've done good, Henry." He nodded, eyes soft. "Wasn't just me." He looked at Rust. "Couldn't have found my way without a little help." As the truck rolled away, Henry turned back to the open fields. The irrigation ditches shimmered like silver ribbons under the sun. He felt the pull of the land again, not as a burden, but as belonging. "Looks like the world finally caught up to us," Ben said. "Maybe," Henry replied. "Or maybe we just stopped running from it." They spent the rest of the day fixing a section of fence, mending it piece by piece. The rhythm of work was slow, steady, honest, the same kind that had built their lives. Rust stayed nearby, grazing lazily, tail flicking in the breeze. When evening came, they sat on the porch steps, watching the horizon fade into copper and purple. The first stars blinked awake. Henry leaned back, tired and content. "You ever think about what's next?" Ben asked. Henry smiled. "Tomorrow'll tell us. That's enough for me." Rust gave a soft snort, like an agreement. And then, as night settled over the Nevada plains, the last light brushed the canyon once more, turning every grain of dust to silver. The horse stood still, the man beside him, the land between them. Quiet, whole, eternal. In that silence, everything they'd lost had found its way home. If this story touched your heart, leave a simple comment. Just type 0 or 1 to let us know you were here, still believing in kindness. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story. Another journey of hope between people and the animals that change our lives forever.